What's going on, guys? So today we're going to be talking about the skull crusher. Now, we're going to be doing two different variations, dumbbell and barbell. Yes, they're very similar, but there's also a couple differences that are worth noting. Now, when we do these variations, I'm going to put a slight spin on the traditional skull crusher. Generally, we have the feet down on the ground. And what can tend to happen is as we go into that full extension and we let those elbows stay back a little bit more, as that weight gets heavier, we can be more prone to put that torso into extension. So to counter that, we're gonna put our feet on the wall, and that's gonna help us keep that torso down and try to keep a more true rib position so we can actually make the triceps work and go into their fullest extent of extension. So for the dumbbell variation, we're going hips 90 degrees, feet against the wall, light pressure into the wall here with the feet. We're grabbing our dumbbells. We're gonna bring the elbows back a little bit. We don't wanna be perpendicular because at lockout what ends up happening is when we're perpendicular, we're taking the stress away from the triceps. So by bringing them back a little bit, we're gonna be able to target the tricep heads a little bit better through the full range of motion, especially at lockout. So with dumbbells, slowly lower down, try to get a nice deep range of motion. And what you can do at the bottom here is if you have to, if your bench is wide, you can turn the dumbbells out a little bit so they clear, and then as you come back up, you'll bring them back in, fighting to keep those elbows tight. Now with dumbbells, it's generally a little bit easier on folks' elbows because the barbell can put you into an amount of pronation that is sometimes uncomfortable. So with dumbbells, we get a little bit more range here and a little bit more mobility with the wrists, but we have to be very conscious of what our elbows are doing. So what I like to think about is having a band that is imaginary pulling the elbows together. And that's gonna keep that nice tight elbow position. And again, at lockout, we are keeping the elbows slightly back, and that's to keep more tension on the triceps. All right, so 3 quick tips for doing dumbbell skull crushers. And I touched on these a little bit in the how-to, but tip number 1, elbows slightly back. Tip number 2, pretend there's a band literally pulling these elbows together. A lot of times when we go into extension, we can sometimes flare those elbows out, and that's a means to compensate for the weight and not allowing the triceps to go into full extension. Tip number 3, try to get a nice deep range down here at the bottom, and then as you come up, think as though there's almost a rope pulling this dumbbell out and around, and then lock out and think about almost pushing up a tiny bit through the thumb side on the palm. That's gonna help you create a really strong extension and also really nail your lockout mechanics. All right, so for the barbell skull crush, pretty much everything's gonna stay consistent. The only real difference is the cueing of what we're gonna be doing with our elbows. Since we have a fixed wrist position versus being able to be a little bit more dynamic, we have to be a tiny bit more conscious of what we're doing with our elbows. So we're gonna go into our position, hips down, torso down, feet against the wall. I use a suicide grip. You can fully grip. If you're newer to doing barbell skull crush, I would definitely recommend doing a full grip. I like to go suicide. It's just generally a little bit more comfortable. Letting the barbell sit in the meat of the hands. We're not letting the barbell control what we're doing. Our wrists stay relatively fixed the whole time, letting that barbell sit into the meat of the hands. So we're gonna keep our elbows back a tiny bit, making sure that there's tension on the triceps before going into the eccentric, and then we're gonna lower down slowly. And again, we're cueing the elbows to stay in the whole time. With barbell, it can be a little bit tougher, I think, for folks to keep those elbows in, especially if there is any mobility issues or like wrist pain going on. So with the barbell, everything is gonna stay consistent compared to what we did with our dumbbell, but just be hyper-focused on the elbows and what you're doing with them, especially as you transition from that eccentric to concentric movement pattern. All right, guys, so if you don't have a wall available, there are 2 different variations you could do. Number 1 is you could just do the traditional feet down on the ground. The only thing I will say then is be very conscious of what you're doing with your torso. If you're throwing your hips up, going into extension to complete the skull crush, you're leaving gains on the table. So what you can do instead, if you don't have a wall and you don't want to put your feet on the ground, is put them up on the bench, the next best thing. And if you have a box, you can also put it at the end here. If you are taller with a longer torso, you can put your feet up here on the box. But generally, the feet on the bench will suffice just fine when it comes to helping you keep that torso down. It's just, you have to be a little bit more conscious compared to the wall because you're not in such a natural position to have the pelvis grounded. So be conscious of your hips, but if you put your feet on the bench, it'll work just as fine. All right guys, hopefully you're able to take something away from this video. I tried to make the skull crush as productive as possible. It's one of my favorite triceps exercises, so that's why I've added the wall, and I've really tried to focus on leveling up how effective we're trying to make it for different gains, whether that be hypertrophy, strength, and so forth. And if you guys like this video, as always, drop a like, drop a subscribe to the channel. I'll see you guys in the next one.